Not everybody mobilises. There are those who are like, oh, it's a bit far to go, I can't be bothered. But the thing that really struck me from the leaders lead and the people offer themselves willingly is leaders is plural. So it's Deborah and the other leaders, but the people offer themselves willingly. And I sometimes worry that in church generally, with all these things about leadership, where's the conference about following? I can be a leader as well as a follower, or a follower as well as a leader. And this willingness seems to be one of the key things that is called out. So they're not begrudging participants, they're willing. One of the things that Deborah is gifted in is in mobilising. She presents, here's what God is calling us to do, and people buy into it.
Welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life, a podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church here in... It's not sunny, it's just dreich right now. There's a good Scottish word to get us going. They're like they say about people that live up north that have lots of words for snow. We have lots of words for rain and bad weather. Brodie, what's your favourite Scottish word for describing poor weather?
It's blowing a hoolie, but do you know what? It's nice on the south side of Glasgow. I had a very pleasant walk into work this morning.
Sun shining on the righteous. Ian, favourite Scottish word for describing the weather?
Oh gosh, can't think of that. I think sunshine is a favourite word because it's so unusual to be able to say it. So my favourite word for weather in Scotland is it's sunny. And it is today.
Jack, you're an East Coaster. You've got lots of random words for the weather.
Yeah, I'm more concerned that you and I are experiencing the weather in the same place completely differently today, because I think it's all right.
I'm looking out the window here and all I can see is grey sky. It looks like it's drizzling outside.
I think I judge the weather according to whether it's useful for drying and washing. There you go.
All right,
There's a new level of tragedy in my life.
Well, my current level of tragedy is that right now I judge the weather based on whether it's drying the grass that we've cut for the horses outside in the fields for the next 3 days. So no rain, please. Otherwise, we have a wasted crop. But there we go. That's my little farm aside for this morning. Brodie, we were delving into the book of Judges at the weekend, particularly the story of Deborah. It's not a straightforward story, so before I ask you for a 60-second summary of what you actually spoke on, can you give us a 60-second, or maybe even a bit longer, summary of where we are in the book of Judges?
Well, the book of Judges, interestingly, isn't chronological. Richard, you'll like this. It's geographical. The judges are ordered according to geography. So you start at the south and move north. And Deborah is a female judge. The story is told in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4 is a narrative account. And I just want to make a correction. It's always dangerous when you ad-lib. I was trying to kind of say, there's a difference between chapter 4 and chapter 5, and I kind of did go down and chapter 4 was written by a man, chapter 5 was written by a woman, and I started to draw out differences that do not exist. The difference, I think, is in what jail might have disclosed to a man and what jail might have disclosed to a woman. So anyway, that's my correction there.
Not that men are more factual and women are more poetic.
Yes, that is not the point. That I did make that point and I am wrong and I apologise.
That's Corrections Corner for this week.
Yeah, the Judges 5 itself is a song, so it's a poem. So we've got to read it as a poem. So it's not trying to give us raw data. It's trying to paint a picture of who God is and who we are as his people. And the things that poetry and song do is that they stir our emotions as well. So it's meant to stir us up. It's split into 4 stanzas. And I used that structure to help me structure what I said on Sunday. There's some tricky translation bits. The NIV on a whole does actually a really good job. If you're reading the Revised Standard and things like that, then it's going to look slightly differently. And where did I go with it? So I thought, do you know what? One of the big things that whoever wrote this poem is trying to tell us is how God works in the world. But I started as well of, do you know what, Israel kept getting itself into trouble because of wrong worship of God. They kept adding other foreign gods to their worship of God, treating God like any other God, trying to manipulate God, trying to bend God to their own agenda and their own will. And the song starts with praise of God. Bless the Lord. And just that reminder of, do you know what are the idols that we're building up? These aren't things that are necessarily wrong, but if we get them in the wrong place, then they start to distort everything. So that importance of the correction to wrong worship is right worship. And that's not just about song singing, it's wider than that. It's what we value, what's shaping our desires and our dreams. And then I guess one of the big things that I wanted to try and highlight was that as God works, and it's the song most definitely says that it's God who's working, it's God who's fighting this battle, but we're called to participate in that. So we're in a battle, but there's multiple players in this, so it doesn't just all fall on Deborah. Deborah knows her role, her giftedness, her authority, but knows what other people should do as well. And then, of course, there's the unexpectedness of God uses not the obvious choices. So in the poem, Shamgar is dropped in along with Jael, two people that we don't know an awful lot about. And one of the things that struck me was they can, like, in some sense, subvert this militaristic war narrative in that the victories that they achieve using everyday domestic implements. Shamgar, an ox goad, Jael, a hammer and tent peg. And it's not about having the right stuff, it's about being God's person in that moment and using what God asks us to do. And then we kind of like ended, or nearly ended, with what happens to Jael and her killing of Sisera, and that the poem is, I think, heavily suggestive that there was sexual violence towards Jael, and that was what instigated her violence towards Sisera, and yet she's called blessed. So something happens there with regards to healing and restoration. And then the poem finishes with a kind of like, may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but to those who love the Lord, may they rise like the sun in its might. So that's more than a 60-second summary, but that was my summary.
So not much going on in chapters 4 and 5 then.
There's a lot.
quite a quiet piece of Old Testament literature.
Well, you think, do you know what? It is an exercise in how to kind of like, how to write briefly and have a lot in it, which I'm not good at doing.
Well, I think staying with that, if I can sort of briefly go down a tangent or a rabbit trail that's maybe not your key thing, I think it was really interesting that you highlighted the differences between chapters 4 and 5, and the fact that one is like, here's the factual story, and the other one is the use of imagery and poetic language and so on. I feel like sometimes there's a tendency for us to be uncomfortable with those parts of scripture where it all feels like, oh, there's interpretation, like we're going to have to spend a minute trying to understand what this is actually referencing. And it can be interpreted in multiple ways and so on. But it actually brings so much. If you read the chapters side by side, it actually brings a lot. And I think there's a challenge for us, even in this, just of actually reading our Bibles in a way that allows us to embrace more of that kind of language and the poetic kind of language, when oftentimes actually just what we want is cold, hard facts and instructions.
Yeah, so I think biblical interpretation is a bit like painting a picture, in that we have a canvas on which we can paint, but if we go off the canvas, we're making a mess. So we can't just interpret scripture any old way we want. So one of the early church fathers kind of like says of some heretics, because the people who proposed heresy, they were using scripture as well, of they're reading scripture wrong because they're ignoring the rule of faith. In other words, there was kind of like a very basic, here's how you interpret scripture rightly. So there would be certain things that we would say, here's what helps us interpret scripture. Who Jesus is, that he is God incarnate, that God is triune. Those things start to help us. So I went off on a wee kind of like tangent of this is full of violence, physical violence, other kinds of violence. And yet Jesus says, love your enemies, put away your sword. How do we then read this stuff in light of who Jesus is? So that's an instance of using the framework, that boundary, to paint on the canvas without going off it.
Yeah, you've brought up the violence point there. And so I'm going to go, that's not where I was actually going to go, but now you've mentioned it, so I am going to. This is particularly a violent book in the Bible. I think, Richard and I had been having this conversation last night, and he was referencing a story. Was it in America somewhere where they...
Yeah, so there is, I don't wish to denigrate our colleagues across the water, but they do some things that have slightly unintended consequences from time to time in the way that they mix religion and politics. And there's one county in the States whereby those that kind of follow these things as people banning books about all sorts of things, and as a retort to that, somebody pointed out and managed to get the Bible banned because it was a county school in a place called Escambia, and complained about the Bible being inappropriate for children because, according to complaint, it contains sexism, sex violence, genocide, slavery, rape, bestiality, includes examples of eating children, and causes religious trauma. Which, when you read that, you can't really disagree with any of that because it does contain that. But I suppose you can contextualise it, which is what you're really, really saying, Brodie, is there's telling a story and then there's saying how things should be.
Yeah, and I think that was my sort of question or point was going to be, I think it was so important that you highlighted that part about violence, because we can read Judges and kind of assume that God is this God of war and violence, and actually that was never his intention.
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple of things of, and I've forgotten what they are. So one of them is, so a very early heresy it's called Marcionianism, after a guy called Marcion, who said, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament are two different gods. And he tried to rip out the Old Testament. The problem is that the New Testament is so full of the Old Testament that he ended up with some Swiss cheese kind of thing. And God doesn't change. So there's a lot going on there. And the as it were, the lenses, the glasses through which I think we read our Old Testament is A, Trinitarian, and B, through Jesus. So Jesus says several times, you've heard it said, but here's what I say to you. So he's our interpretive grid. It means that the Old Testament's still authoritative. God still reveals himself. God still speaks to us. So we can't say we're going to ignore it. We need to engage with it. But very often there's a bit more work to be done there. But everything's interpretive. I've got to interpret what you're saying to me. Mm-hmm. So we're interpreting all the time. And I can remember once hearing it was on Radio Scotland, of a police chief talking about a case that they were dealing with. And he said, we worry not when eyewitness accounts differ, but when eyewitness accounts line up too neatly. Mm-hmm. Said, because you can be in the same situation and, well, we've already had it. Richard thinks the weather's dreich. You think you can hang the washing out. And you're in the same place looking at the same thing and describing it differently. And I think that speaks of lots of things. For me, one of the things it speaks of is, and you know what, God meets me as me and not as Ian or Mary or Josh, or God meets me as me, and speaks to me as me. So yeah, I can't remember what the other point was I was thinking of. It'll come back to me at some point.
The key player in the story that I'm taking as the key player in the story is Deborah, the prophet. And maybe that's just as a woman that I'm loving seeing this woman in leadership as a prophet and her impact in this story. And I wondered, Ian, what is your sense of how she, as a prophet, goes to the leader and says, this is what God is calling you to do, and how he then responds to her?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fascinating things just in the account of Deborah and her interactions with Barak, who is her general chief of staff character who has been given the task of confronting the attacking enemies. Even before you get into that, I think it is just interesting how she is described, because she's described as a judge, which is basically the title that is given to the primary political leader of the tribes. So she is given that position, and then it indicates that actually she performs those duties. So she executes the role of a judge, and she sits in judgment. So there is no debate about her position. So she has that status as a woman. But of course, you can have a position, and then the question is, how do you enact that? Do you live up to the role that you have been given? Do you live out the position? I think what's interesting about her is that she's the courageous person in this. Barak kind of comes to her and sort of says, I'm not really entirely sure about whether we should be doing this. Will you come with me? And she says, well, I'll come with you, but you're not going to get all the credit. So she instructs him. We might want to go into, here's somebody who is operating prophetically in a position of authoritative leadership. And what does that look like? But I think what is interesting is that she's a courageous person. It's clear she's got limited military assets. She's got a general who's not too keen in actually going to war. The tribes are kind of reluctant. Half of them decide they're not actually going to engage in this. And yet she still has this incredible confidence in God. And I think that just speaks this whole thing about leadership, that if you are driven by the anxieties of other people or the fear that drives other people, then nothing is going to happen. And it's that whole thing about, well, somebody needs to stick their head above the parapet. Somebody needs to say, I trust God, and this is what we need to do, even if all the data and all the analysis is saying this is not looking good for us. And I think that's just what's really striking for me about Deborah, is that just in a few short sentences, you really see her acting as a leader who is confident that God will bring deliverance, that it's not just an exercise of power, but that she's confident that God will do something. And I think that just speaks to what all of us need to be in these days. We need to be people who are brave and confident in God, because there's a lot of hostility around. And so I was really just struck by her courage.
There is, in verse 2 of chapter 5, in my version, it's saying, and the people gladly followed. Israel's leaders took charge and the people gladly followed. I don't know what other people's, the NIV or so on is saying. But certainly the suggestion is that there is a great willingness to follow Deborah and Barak together. But certainly also from the suggestion of how she was perceived as a judge, there's also the suggestion that clearly people were willing to take all of their things before her to look for her wisdom into situations. So she clearly was well thought of. And I think that as the story progresses, you're seeing that it also mentions in chapter 5 that the tribe of, is it Reuben? They talk about the tribe of Reuben not going. I think that's in verse 15, that there was great indecision. So there's sort of a little bit of a contrast in that the suggestion is that people were willingly following her, but then there are also some tribes who didn't get involved for whatever reason. And I think you're already sort of alluding to that point of that sometimes you're making decisions and you're not going to have everybody on board. And people-pleasing leadership is not necessarily God-pleasing leadership.
Just out of interest, my particular translation was NASB. The verse 2 in chapter 5 is the leaders led and the people volunteered. And that I think that's quite appropriate. If leaders lead properly, then people volunteer. And so maybe the reverse is true. If people aren't volunteering, maybe people aren't leading properly. There's a challenge.
Well, I think there's always the case that if you're seeking to lead, you're taking, or you ought to be taking the temperature and the direction from God. And, that's not something that everybody else is going to wholeheartedly or readily engage with. And even Barak doesn't, he's hesitating in all of this. So I think once you read a bit deeper into this, you realize, well, you've got, there are at least 3 tribes, just kind of brief look at it, who back out. You've got Gilead staying behind the Jordan. You've got Dan lingering by the ships. Asher remained on the coast. And then it's the Zebulun and Naphtali, they got stuck in. So I think if you're always assuming that you have to have complete buy-in, if you're enthralled to the expectations and demands of the most hesitant, then you're not going to be courageous. I'm just reading a really brilliant book. It's a really challenging book to read, but it's called The Age of Anxiety. It's called The Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. It was written about 30 years ago, but it could have been written last night. And it's all about the way in which our culture has become driven by a sense of anxiety and fear, and the fear of being dismissed or being litigated against, or the fear just of getting things wrong, or the fear of breaking something and being hurtful. And that has left a massive hesitation. So we've lost this kind of sense of adventure, and leaders are, in his view, really inhibited to separate themselves out from the people who have the strongest voices and opinions, and step back from leadership. So, I kind of saw this in Deborah, that she was not just simply tied to the views of the tribes, but she was determined just to lead out what God was asking of her, and actually to turn up in the field of battle as well.
Is there something, and without having an encyclopedic knowledge of Judges, is there something in the fact that Deborah is described in a twofold sense? She's described as both a prophetess and a judge, whereas I think most of the other judges in the book of Judges are just described as judges. That's the main thing. She's got this kind of, on the one hand, she sits and she waits for people to bring her stuff, but also as a prophetess, she's also speaking into a situation in a stepping out kind of way, rather than just waiting for everything to come in.
So she has 3 roles, not just 2, and most of the other judges have 2 roles of.
Right. Okay.
So she's prophet, judge, and deliverer, whereas others are judges and deliverer, and even the kind of judging can be different. So, as Ian, I think, already has said, there's this tree called the Tree of Deborah, and it looks like people are coming to bring disputes and other things to her. So she's functioning as that social, political, religious decision maker, making judgment about issues, as well as in her role as deliverer, enacting judgment on idolatry, which is the big theme of the book of Judges. And I think the other thing that she is a mobiliser. Now, not everybody, as Ian just said, mobilises. There are those, and again, this is slightly geographically based, who are like, it's a bit far to go, I can't be bothered, kind of thing going on. But the thing that really struck me from the leaders lead and the people offer themselves willingly, or the people volunteer, is leaders is plural. So it's Deborah and the other leaders. Barak, is he a weak leader? Is he a strong leader? There's debate around that, but he still leads. And in some respects, Deborah compensates for his weakness, or comes alongside his hesitation. So he should have just gone to the battle. He didn't need Deborah to go with him. But she says, okay, I'll go, because she realised there was a job needed to be done and he had a role to play in it. But the people offer themselves willingly, and I sometimes worry that in church generally, so not just QP, but kind of like across probably the whole globe, but certainly the Western world, with all these things about leadership, where's the conference about following, about being the willing participants? Because again, while there's this multiplicity of leadership, Deborah is still the one who is the primary leader, who has to make decisions. She's the one, as Ian said, who sticks her head above the parapet, kind of thing. So while leadership can be plural or multiple, there still needs to be somebody, some mechanism by which we come to make decisions and move forward and go into action. And our roles can be multiple. So I can be a leader as well as a follower, or a follower as well as a leader. We need both, and we have both here. And this willingness seems to be one of the key things that is called out. So they're not begrudging participants. They're not coerced. It's not kind of like with a spear in their back forcing them forward. They're willing. So I think one of the things that Deborah undoubtedly is gifted in is in mobilising. You know, we would call it, I don't know, I hate the term vision casting and things like that, but she presents, you know, here's what God is calling us to do, and people buy into it.
How much do you suppose that the history that she had with the people made her more trustworthy? She had, I'm trying to think of what the word would be, but it was easier for people to buy in. It was easier for Barak to buy in because she had operated as a judge and a deliverer and a prophetess for a period of time before she comes with this. This is not, she doesn't walk in, here's my prophetic word for you, and people then have to respond. She has history. There's some previous demonstration of her wisdom and of her relationship with God that makes it easier for others to listen to her and to want to follow. And I suppose for all of us, there's an equivalence of that for all of us, that people need to see leaders being trustworthy and need to know that their leaders are hearing from God and so on, because that makes it easier to follow and to want to. Ian, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, there's a sense in which credibility and integrity are the building blocks on which she makes that call. I remember somebody discussing leadership and saying that trust is the currency of leadership. And I've certainly sort of felt that over the years, that you almost have a trust bank, that you build up over time through perhaps the small decisions, as Deborah was making with this family and this group here and there. That builds up a bank of trust, which you cash in when you have to make the big calls, which is what may well be happening. I think the other thing that can also happen for us is that you can also drain that trust bank sometimes just by making hard calls. Sometimes actually drains the trust bank. There's things that you have to do that you can't fully explain, or somebody has to make a hard choice. And not everybody likes that. So that drains the trust bank. I think there are times when maybe if you're doing anything for a long time, you make a wrong call every now and then, and that drains the trust bank. And then it takes a lot more sitting under the tree of Deborah, judging, sort of small situations and small things, or at least engaging small, acts that builds up that trust. So I think actually kind of seeing trust and that sort of level of integrity as being the background that the leadership is built upon is actually quite an important consideration.
Cool. Well, as was trailed on Sunday, Brodie prepared some extra time for us. So in the same way as you celebrate when you get extra time at a football match, you don't complain when it goes on longer. We shouldn't complain when the sermon goes on longer, really, I don't think, maybe. But Brodie has recorded some added extra, specifically some sort of discussion about white donkeys, but we'll let that go on. So we're going to drop in a wee 3 to 4 minute piece of additional audio, and then we're going to have a chat about it. Here we go.
On Sunday, when we got to Judges 5 verses 10 and following that section there that starts with the white donkeys, I said, do you know what, we don't have time to unpack what's in this, important as it is. We'll maybe try and do that in the podcast. So this is that section. And it's not that the donkeys are white are important. I'm sure that perhaps has some importance, but that's not what I think is important for us to hear from this passage, this bit just now. It's who's riding on the donkeys. And there looks to be 2 options. It most probably is travelling minstrels, but it could also be travelling merchants. And in some respects, that doesn't matter. What is important is here we have a group of people who travel around the region and who gather where others gather at watering holes. And they have been commissioned, they have been commanded to proclaim and to speak of God's just acts. And perhaps, hopefully, you see the parallels that I see there of, we've been given the same commission, have we not? To speak of God's just acts, of the good news of Jesus. And just as these people on the donkeys were scattered across Israel to where people would gather to share news, so many of us are scattered across this city and this greater Glasgow region to places of work or gym or other social settings where people gather and people chat about how's your week been, what have you been doing, what's happening in your life, opportunities to share. And I think it's really significant that these wandering minstrels, these merchants, have to proclaim the just deeds of the Lord. We live in a world full of injustice, a world which is desperate for true justice. And justice is an issue that, particular, the youth of the world are passionate about. The commission that we've been given, the message we have of the just deeds of the Lord, could not be more relevant and more timely. So perhaps this week you join me in praying for an opportunity to speak of God's heart for justice with somebody who needs to hear about it. And one of the things that excites me about talking about God's justice is that to speak of his justice is to speak of his goodness and his love, because his justice has as its source God's goodness and love. But we need to do more than just talk, don't we? We don't just want to be talking heads. Verse 11 says that the minstrels have not just to sing about the just deeds of the Lord, but the just deeds of his warriors. There are people who enact this justice. And you and I are called to be warriors for justice. What that might look like would take another sermon or another extra time slot to unpack. But I think a good starting place for us is to connect with others who are already participating in seeking God's justice in various situations, both close at home and further afield. Think of the work of Glasgow City Mission in seeking to come alongside people who have suffered lots of different kinds of injustices. The work of Tear Fund, the work and their Just Rubbish campaign. Check that out. That's something that you and I can get involved in locally and easily, but to amplify and speak of some of the other justice works that they're doing. Check out and connect with the work of IJM, International Justice Mission, and the work that they do around modern slavery, or Aroha UK and the work that they're doing around climate justice. Lots of great options. I'm sure you can think of others as well. But let's not just talk of justice, but participate in enacting God's justice as well. So that's some extra time thoughts of the verses that I didn't manage to touch upon on Sunday. I hope that speaks to you.
Okay, Brodie, I think your focus is not so much on the white donkeys as it is on the people involved with the white donkeys. Myself and Jack have both read this in a number of different translations, and sometimes it seems like the white donkeys are involved with people who aren't the merchants and traders and minstrels, and sometimes it seems like they are. So give us your chat on what is important about this passage, because it's probably not the white donkeys.
Yeah, so I think what is important about the passage is that here we have people, and we're not entirely sure who they are. So they're minstrels or traders or something like that. But people who are going around the region, around the nation, who've been commissioned to proclaim something. And they're going to the watering holes, so where people would gather and exchange ideas, do business, be refreshed, show hospitality. So all those different things are going on there. And they've been commanded to speak of God's just acts. And it struck me of, do you know what? We've been given that commission to go out into all the world and share the good news of Jesus, which is good news about justice. It struck me that in particular young people are sensitive to this issue of justice. They look at a world and they see a world full of injustice. They see a world in which past generations, including mine, have messed things up, and they grieve for that and desire justice. And I guess when young people look at the church, do they see us as a people who are passionate for justice, to see a world put right? Or do we see, do they see them, do you see us as people who are sitting in judgment over them? Of you're doing it all wrong, what do you know, you're young. So I think there's a challenge for us to really speak out about God's justice which I think is rooted in his goodness and his love. But these minstrels or merchants have not just to kind of speak about God's justice, but also the just acts of his warriors. And we are called to participate in God's justice, not just talk about it. So how do we do that? And I suggested in the wee drop in that a good place to do that is, who do we know that is already involved practically in acts of justice? Because very often it's, we're back to that building up trust. It's the small things. We've got to start somewhere. So joining Tier Fund's Just Rubbish campaign, going and volunteering at the City Mission, connecting with the work of IJM or Arocha UK. There's loads and loads of options out there, but not just to speak of God's justice, but to be actively involved in it as well.
I was simply going to ask, I'm not sure if it's clear, as you go from verses 10 and 11 into 12, when it has awake, awake, Deborah, awake, sing a song. Is there a suggestion that those musicians, minstrels, whomever we're referring to them as, are stirring up there, or is that actually not them who are saying the awake, awake, Deborah? Sorry, this is personal information I'd like to understand. Because it's just that if they are, it's interesting to me then, if those are the people whom they are championing testimony, they are championing what is going on, they are championing what, I should have chosen a different word, all that God is doing, and then they're also stirring up. It feels like to me that like they feel like you're talking about there being multiple players in the stories and multiple ministries. Those encouragers, those Barnabas people who are going, come on, let's go. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, so that they're doing both. I think they're championing. So they're speaking of what God has done, but they're saying, awake, awake, Deborah, awake. Rise, Barak, is almost, I think, calling forth new Deborahs and new Baraks of you do likewise, just as Deborah awoke and arose, just as Barak arose and enacted God's justice. So we as God's people should arise and enact God's justice.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Jackie, I mean, it's not really a rabbit hole, but it just really just generates a whole other area that we maybe should dive into at some point, which is just actually that worship and justice are deeply connected in Scripture. And if you look at something like Isaiah 58, you've got this, false worship is bad justice. But actually good worship generates the sense of God's justice and of our call into the world for things to be done in line with God's goodness and rightness. So I think maybe this is just, kicking the ball along the road a little bit, but it would be good to have a conversation sometime about the role of worship and of justice. But I suppose just kind of circling back to where we were, it's just kind of struck me just this week, really just kind of thinking about a few things, the way in which Jesus is described as being powerful in word and deed. And I think often we kind of oscillate between, being powerful in word and powerful in deed, and, that almost kind of making a conflict between these two things. But actually, and I would just suggest that, yes, absolutely, we need to encourage people to get involved in justice issues. But I think maybe this is my personal challenge, is what does that prophetic voice look like in the public square? We're good at doing good deeds, and our culture is very happy for the church to do good deeds because that's what our culture thinks we should be doing. But is that, where is the prophetic challenge that comes? Where is the distinctive voice that comes into our culture that kind of, as the song says, kind of stirs up the people at the water holes and at the city gates, and isn't just confirming and consolidating, contemporary liberal or conservative perspectives on what justice should be. So, what is that Christian distinctive voice, as well as distinctive actions? Sorry, that's gone down a whole different channel, but I just think that whole thing about how it is about words.
I feel like that should be next week.
It is about words and deeds, and how do we communicate that positive challenge, that how do you connect Jesus and justice? Maybe that's the conversation we have.
As we kind of bring our thoughts to a close, what I think is interesting about what you've just said, and Jack, in terms of people being stirred up to things, people being encouraged to things, people being pushed forward into things, is that the whole thing then ends with the phrase, and the land was undisturbed for 40 years. And the contrast, like, when was the last time anything in our world was undisturbed for 40 minutes? Let alone 40 years. When was the last time you had a moment's peace and quiet? It feels like this kind of sublime end to 2 chapters of chaos and just stuff, shouting, wailing, tent pegs, murder, pillage, rape, all sorts of horribleness. And then it's like, and the land was undisturbed for 40 years.
All ready to go again for the following chapters.
Yeah, all ready to go again. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. It's just 40 years. It wasn't forever. No. I think maybe it's just as I'm getting older, the idea of rest just becomes so much more appealing. A nice sit down with a cup of coffee. I don't know. But just the way that Judges kind of pivots from all of this stuff happening to this, and it was all undisturbed for 40 years. I don't know. Is it just me that finds that supremely appealing right now?
So I'm not sure it was as nice as what you think, Richard.
Yeah, nor am I.
Don't snatch it away from me. It's like Bad Santa.
Yeah. I mean, there's a period where they have peace for 80 years. But clearly during those 40 years, the work that Deborah had been doing beforehand is most likely still going on. She's back under her palm tree, judging. The sad truth is that during this period, people begin to drift. People begin to worship false gods again. People begin to take God for granted, or treat God like any other god. And therefore, the 40 years comes to an end, and you have oppression and goodness knows what by foreign powers, which is a lot of it has to do with Israel's wandering away from true worship and who God is. Yeah, so that's starting to creep in as well, and I think that speaks of several challenges of how do we pass on the stories of what God has done in our generation to the next generation, or generations, but also of us keeping close to God, continuing to worship God, being continually faithful to Him is the big challenge for that regular kind of like spiritual MOT of, am I starting to kind of like put other things before God, etc. So yeah, I'm not sure it was as good as what you think.
I'm nervous that Richard's going to get us doing a roundup, and I just want to get in.
Yeah, I can see your face. Ian's desperately scribbling. I need to say something else. Jack's like, don't say it's one final thought. Okay, Jack, it's not one final thought yet. You get another round, another go.
I honestly feel like we could. I feel like this every week at the moment, but all the things we're talking about, I feel like there's another hour of conversation to be had. There was just a couple of things. I think one is, and we've only lightly touched on it, but the whole book of Judges is such a warning about idolatry. And it's hard to avoid that. It's hard to escape that. And I feel like we see oftentimes, I think we can look at Old Testament idolatry as being so separate from our current cultural idolatries. I think we see them as something, bad that the Israelites were doing that actually involved building a god that out of something, and we see our own idolatry as just something mild or not as bad. And it feels like that's a whole other conversation. But I also wanted to mention, you talked about the multiple ministries piece, and you referenced Ephesians 4. And I think what's really interesting as well about these two chapters is that there are so many players, there are so many key moments in the story, and it feels like an invitation to all of us, like, who do you feel like in the story? Who do you relate to? Who does it feel like you can easily be? What's your invitation into at any given point? Because I also think what's interesting is that at the point at which Barak invites Deborah to go with him, and she says, well, the victory is no longer going to be honoured as yours, it's going to be at the hands of a woman. And I have wondered, is that the point at which Jael becomes the key player? Because it seems interesting to me that she is the one that ends up killing Sisera. And did it need to happen that way? What is the significance of that being separated out like that as the way that he comes to his end? Because everybody else in the story, it says, is killed in battle. Like the chaos ensues, they're all killed, yet he survives, goes off to this story. I'm still unclear as to whether, because it seems that her husband is friends with the family of the king, so the suggestion would seem to be that the loyalty goes one way, but actually, was it always her intention to kill him until he was violent? I mean, I don't know. So many questions. So interesting. Such an incredibly rich passage with much to glean from it. Sorry, Richard. I'm shutting up now.
Not at all. Ian is now reclining, listening to all of this in his chair. So Ian, as punishment for your reclamation, is that right word?
No.
For your recliningment, you get the first final word.
Okay, so yeah, I had a few other words, but yeah, let's go to the final word. So interestingly, total aside, I was on the phone with my mum last night, and she said, I've been busy because I've been looking for tent pegs. So maybe, so she was providing tent pegs for somebody. So maybe every woman needs to have a tent peg somewhere available in the house. So that's not my final word. In fact, I'm not too sure what the final word is. I mean, it's maybe not a final word, but maybe just a reflection on Richard's desire for rest, because the land at rest is part of this rhythm that cycles round in Judges, and it suggests the optimal position of God's people in relation to God and the land and one another. Judges doesn't use the word shalom here, but it's a word that's often bandied about as that place of harmony between God, people and the land, people and one another. So actually, I think when the false worship is removed from the land is at rest. And so this is a moment, these 40 years are a moment of witness to what true allegiance to God and a true embodying in the people and society of godly values looks like. So I see that as a real contrast to false worship and idolatry, because the lie and the invitation of false worship is, this will give you satisfaction. This will actually bring you to a place of peace. But what this text is saying is actually that true worship, where idolatry is removed, actually brings rest. So Richard, your heart desire is the right desire. But so just watch out for idolatry, because that's that's the strategy of the enemy to distract us from God's provision of rest.
Excellent. Jack?
I mean, I think I've already demonstrated I've got lots of final words. So I think that...
Pick one.
I'm aware that probably it's mostly, from your statistics, it appears that mostly men listen to the podcast and not women. However...
No. Just that proportionately to more men listen, it's about 60-40, which is interesting because the church congregation is probably the other way around.
Okay. I just,
so there you go.
I just feel that I have really, really enjoyed, thank you, Ian and Brodie, that we have looked at so many significant women in the Old Testament. And I suppose I want to encourage women everywhere that the significance of what God has for you does not need to be diminished by you being a woman in any way, shape or form. God is the ultimate champion of women. And I love that women do the things that they do in a very female way. They don't need to be men in order to do it. They can be fully and authentically themselves. So that's my shout out.
Good stuff. Brodie, you preached it. Final word to you.
It's, I guess, picking up on what Jackie said there. I think one of the interesting things here is in both chapters 4 and 5 of that, in one sense, for us reading it, gender's important. It's important that Deborah's a woman and Jael's a woman. But what qualifies these people to do what they're doing is their anointing, their obedience, their competency. That it's not, here we see Deborah and Barak, and we have the debate whether was he a weak leader or not. Anyway, they work cooperatively and God's purposes are enacted. And I think, again, the thing that strikes me in all of this is that you can't fit God in a box. That with Shamgar and with Jael, it's the unexpected person that quite literally strikes a decisive blow using very ordinary things. And it challenges me of who am I overlooking? Who am I kind of like saying, oh, they could never account to much, and yet God has a job for them to do. What are the ordinary things that we have at hand? Because we can sometimes, if only I had such and such, or we as a church had this, we'd be able to do that. And yet it was the everyday implements that they had at hand that God used powerfully. And then for Jael, of who is called blessed, of and on Sunday, touched that I think Sisera violently and sexually attacks her, that she's not defined as a victim or stuck as a victim, but transcends that. For sure, it's part of her history, it's part of what has happened to her, but she transcends that. And for me, that's just such a message of hope and of God's goodness and of God's grace, that God in the end wins. Mm-hmm. And we need to pick a side. Whose side are we on?
Great stuff. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, all of you good listeners, for listening. Next week, we are going to try and do another Q&A, possibly. Although, who knows, because Ian might just take us down an entirely different rabbit trail. We might just have a whole week on Trinitarian theology or predestination or something else. Who knows? But you may see us roving around at the church with a microphone looking to get your questions. But if you'd rather just send them in, you can email office@qpbc.org. Send us in your question in a written format or an audio one if you wish to record. If you're listening on Spotify, you can use the Spotify app to actually send us an audio question direct. So thank you again very much for joining us. Please do leave us a review. And just as another aside, the audio from the podcast and from the sermon is now available on the Queen's Park Baptist Church YouTube page. So if YouTube is your preferred method of consuming additional religious media, then you can find us there as well as on your podcast players. So thank you again. Have a great week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.